Most people hear the name Machiavelli and think one thing: evil, manipulative, cold-blooded. And that's the reputation that's followed him for over 500 years. But here's what most people don't know. Niccolò Machiavelli wasn't some shadowy villain pulling strings from a dark throne room. He was a diplomat, a civil servant, a man who spent over a decade in the trenches of Florentine politics, negotiating, observing, watching powerful men rise and fall. And then he lost everything. He was stripped of his position, thrown into prison, tortured, and exiled. So what did he do with all that pain, all that experience? He wrote. He wrote what many consider the most dangerous book on power ever published, The Prince. And The Prince wasn't some abstract philosophical exercise. It was a manual, a distillation of everything Machiavelli had witnessed about how power actually works. Not how it should work, not how we wish it worked, how it works. That distinction matters, because Machiavelli wasn't interested in painting pretty pictures of ideal rulers and utopian states. He looked at the world as it was, messy, brutal, full of betrayal, and he asked one simple question: what does it actually take to survive, to lead, to hold on to power once you have it? And the answers he came up with made people uncomfortable. They still do. See, Machiavelli didn't write for dreamers. He wrote for people who wanted to understand the raw mechanics of human nature and political reality. He argued that good intentions, on their own, are worthless. That being a good person in the traditional sense can actually destroy you if you don't understand the game you're playing. This is why his work endures, not because it teaches cruelty, but because it refuses to look away for hard truths that most people would rather ignore. And that's exactly what we're breaking down today. One of the most important tensions in his entire philosophy: the nice guy versus the Machiavellian prince. What separates them? Why one survives and why the other gets crushed? A ruler can be feared, he can be cunning, he can be harsh when the moment demands it, and Machiavelli would tell you all of that is survivable. A prince can commit a long list of sins and still hold power. But there is one sin that is fatal, one thing that no ruler, no leader, no person in any position of authority recovers from: contempt. Not hatred, contempt. And Machiavelli draws a sharp line between the two. Hatred means people want to destroy you. It means you've wronged them deeply enough that they'll plot, scheme, and risk their own lives to bring you down. That's dangerous, but it's also, in a strange way, a sign of respect. They still take you seriously. Contempt is different. Contempt means they don't even bother. They look at you and see someone not worth fearing, not worth following, not worth the effort of a conspiracy. You're dismissed. You're irrelevant. You're nothing. And Machiavelli warns, that is the death sentence. In chapter 19 of The Prince, he makes this unmistakably clear. He writes that a prince must guard himself against being despised above all else. He lists the qualities that breed contempt: being seen as irresolute, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, indecisive. And he says a prince should guard against these like he would guard against a plague. Now, here's where this connects to the nice guy. The nice guy doesn't get destroyed because he's kind. He gets destroyed because his kindness gets read as weakness, and weakness invites contempt. That's the mechanism Machiavelli identifies. It's not about what you are on the inside, it's about what people perceive you to be. And if they perceive you as someone who can't make hard decisions, who bends to every pressure, who avoids conflict at all costs, they won't hate you. They'll dismiss you. And once you're dismissed, you can't lead, you can't negotiate, you can't command respect. You're done. Machiavelli points out something that most people miss. A ruler who is cruel but decisive will hold power longer than a ruler who is gentle but wavering. Not because cruelty is a virtue, it isn't, but because decisiveness signals strength, and strength is the one thing that keeps contempt at bay. He argues that people will tolerate almost anything from a leader: heavy taxes, strict laws, even acts of calculated severity, as long as they believe that leader is in control, as long as they believe he knows what he's doing and has the spine to see it through. But the moment they sense hesitation, the moment they see a leader who's more concerned with being liked than being effective, that's when the ground starts to shift beneath his feet, and it shifts fast. The Machiavellian prince understands this. He doesn't chase approval. He doesn't need everyone in the room to like him. What he needs is for no one in the room to think he's weak. That's the line he walks, and he walks it deliberately. The nice guy? He walks the opposite direction. He softens his stance to avoid friction. He agrees when he should challenge. He accommodates when he should hold firm. And every single time he does that, he's not earning goodwill. He's earning contempt, quietly, slowly, but surely. Machiavelli isn't telling you to be a tyrant. He's telling you to never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be seen as someone who can be ignored. Because hatred you can manage, enemies you can outmaneuver, but contempt? Once people look at you and feel nothing, no fear, no respect, no weight behind your words, there's no strategy in the world that saves you. That's the one sin power doesn't forgive. Here's where Machiavelli stops being polite, and where most people stop reading carefully, because what he says next is uncomfortable. He makes a claim about human nature that sounds harsh, cold even, but he doesn't flinch from it. In chapter 17 of The Prince, he lays it out plainly. Men, in general, are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. That's not a throwaway line. That's the foundation of his entire political philosophy. And this is where the nice guy gets it wrong, every single time. The nice guy operates on an assumption, a dangerous one. He assumes that if he's good to people, genuinely, consistently good, they'll be good to him in return. That loyalty is earned through kindness, that generosity breeds gratitude. Machiavelli doesn't just disagree with this, he warns against it, because he'd seen firsthand what happens to leaders who govern based on that assumption. They get destroyed, not by enemies, by the very people they were trying to help. See, Machiavelli argues that people will stand by you as long as the cost of standing by you is low, as long as things are going well, as long as danger is far off. They'll praise you, swear loyalty, offer you their blood, their property, their lives, their children, his words. But the moment you actually need them, the moment the stakes are real, they turn. That's not pessimism, that's observation, and Machiavelli was nothing if not an observer. He points out that the nice guy, the leader who builds his entire position on the goodwill of others, is building on sand, because goodwill is conditional. It's transactional, even when it doesn't look like it. People don't love you for who you are. They love you for what you provide. And the moment someone else provides more, or the moment your provision becomes inconvenient, that love evaporates. The Machiavellian prince understands this, not because he hates people, not because he's some kind of monster, but because he refuses to be blindsided by a truth that's been staring everyone in the face since the beginning of recorded history. And here's the part that really stings. Machiavelli argues that the leader who is too trusting, too generous, too forgiving, he doesn't just hurt himself, he hurts everyone who depends on him. Because when he falls, and he will fall, he takes his people down with him. His kindness becomes a liability.
His openness becomes a vulnerability, and the people who were supposed to be protected by his leadership, they pay the price for his naivete. So what does the Machiavellian prince do differently? He doesn't start by asking, how do I make people like me? He starts by asking, what are people actually like? And then he builds from there.
He accounts for betrayal before it happens. He plans for ingratitude. He doesn't assume the worst in every individual, but he never ever assumes the best as a governing principle, because assuming the best is not virtue, it's recklessness dressed up as morality.
Machiavelli isn't telling you to hate people. He's telling you to see them clearly, without the filter of how you wish they were, without the comfortable lie that everyone's going to do the right thing if you just set the example. Some will, many won't. And the leader who can't tell the difference, or worse, the leader who refuses to even look, that leader is already finished. He just doesn't know it yet. That's the brutal truth, and Machiavelli never apologized for saying it.
Machiavelli argues that the greatest leaders in history, the ones who built empires, who held power, who shaped the world, were also, without exception, the greatest liars. Not occasional liars, not reluctant liars, skilled, deliberate, calculated liars. And he doesn't say this to shock you. He says it because he studied it, he watched it, he lived through it.
Machiavelli points out something uncomfortable in chapter 18 of The Prince. He writes that a ruler who has known how to use deception has always risen above one who has relied on honesty alone. That's not opinion. That's his observation of centuries of political history, distilled into a single brutal line. Now, the nice guy hears this and recoils. He says, "But I'd never lie. I'd never manipulate. That's beneath me." And Machiavelli would look at that man and say, "Fine, then you will be destroyed by someone who will."
See, Machiavelli doesn't praise deception for its own sake. He's not telling you to lie to your friends at dinner. He's making a very specific argument about power. He's saying that in any arena where the stakes are real, politics, business, war, the person who refuses to use deception puts themselves at a permanent disadvantage because everyone else is using it, whether they admit it or not. He draws a famous comparison, the fox and the lion. A prince, he argues, must be both. The lion cannot protect himself from traps. The fox cannot protect himself from wolves. So you need the cunning of one and the strength of the other. But here's the key. Machiavelli warns that the one who has best known how to play the fox has always come out ahead. Strength is necessary, but cunning is what keeps you alive. And this is where the nice guy falls apart completely. The nice guy believes that if he's honest, if he's transparent, if he plays fair, the world will reward him. Machiavelli says no. The world doesn't reward fairness. The world rewards results. And the people who get results are the ones who understand when to show their hand and when to hide it. He goes even further. Machiavelli argues that a successful deceiver doesn't just lie. He makes people believe he's the most honest man in the room. That's the real skill, not the deception itself, the appearance of sincerity while practicing deception. He writes that men are so simple, so easily swayed by immediate needs, that someone who deceives will always find those willing to be deceived. He's not just talking about leaders, he's talking about human nature. People want to believe, they want to trust. And a prince who understands this, who can project virtue while acting strategically, will always outmaneuver the one who simply is virtuous and does nothing else. The nice guy is genuine. Nobody's questioning that. But Machiavelli would argue that genuineness without strategy
is just vulnerability. You're walking into a room full of foxes, announcing that you're a sheep and then wondering why you keep getting eaten. Machiavelli isn't telling you to become a sociopath. He's telling you to open your eyes, to recognize that the world operates on a level most people refuse to acknowledge. Now, here's where Machiavelli draws a line that most people don't want to accept. He asks the question directly, is it better to be loved or feared? And he doesn't dance around the answer. He says, ideally, you'd want both. Of course you would. Who wouldn't? But then he hits you with the reality. He says the two rarely exist together, and when you're forced to choose, and you will be forced to choose, fear is the safer bet, every single time. And this is where the nice guy gets it wrong, completely wrong. The nice guy operates on love, on goodwill, on the belief that if he's kind enough, generous enough, agreeable enough, people will be loyal to him, they'll respect him, they'll return the favor when it matters. That's the contract he believes he's signed with the world. Be good, and good comes back. Machiavelli looks at that contract and tears it apart. He argues that love is held together by a chain of obligation, and human beings, being what they are, will break that chain the moment it serves their interest. That's not pessimism, that's observation. He'd seen it, he'd lived it. People loved their leaders right up until the moment it cost them something. Then the love disappeared, quietly, without warning. But fear? Machiavelli points out that fear is sustained by a dread of punishment, and that dread doesn't waver. It doesn't depend on mood or convenience. It's constant. It's reliable. And in a world where reliability is everything, that matters more than affection ever could. So the nice guy builds his relationships on warmth, on people liking him. And when the pressure comes, when the stakes get real, he watches those same people walk away. Not because they're evil, but because they're human. Machiavelli understood that distinction. Most people don't. The Machiavellian prince, on the other hand, doesn't need to be liked. He needs to be respected. He needs people to understand that there are consequences, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. There's a difference, and Machiavelli is very deliberate about it. Because here's the part people always forget. He warns, clearly, explicitly, that a prince must avoid being hated. Fear is useful. Hated is fatal. He draws that line with precision. A leader who is feared but not hated can govern. A leader who is hated will eventually be destroyed. No amount of fear can save him from that. So, how does a prince stay on the right side of that line? Machiavelli says, don't touch people's property. Don't touch their families. You can be stern, you can be firm, you can make hard decisions that no one enjoys. But the moment you become greedy, the moment you become predatory, you've crossed from fear into hatred, and there's no coming back from that. This is the cruel math. Love feels better. It's warmer, it's more comfortable, but it's fragile. It bends under pressure and breaks under betrayal. Fear, properly managed, properly restrained, holds. It endures. It doesn't need people to be good. It just needs them to be rational. And Machiavelli, above all else, was a man who built his entire framework on what people actually are. Not what they should be, not what we wish they were, what they are. The nice guy bets on the best in people. The Machiavellian prince prepares for the worst. And when the worst shows up, and Machiavelli assures us it will, only one of them is still standing. Here's where Machiavelli draws the sharpest line between the nice guy and the prince. The nice guy has one mode, one setting. He's kind, he's agreeable, he's accommodating, And he is that way all the time, regardless of who he's dealing with, regardless of what the situation actually calls for. Machiavelli sees this as a fatal flaw, not because kindness is wrong, but because consistency, when it becomes rigidity, is a death sentence.
Machiavelli argues that a prince must be a chameleon. He must know when to be gentle and when to be fierce, when to extend a hand and when to close a fist. He lays this out with one of his most famous metaphors, the fox and the lion. The fox is cunning, it sees the traps. The lion is powerful, it scares off the wolves. And Machiavelli's point is blunt. You need to be both. A leader who is only a lion, all force, no subtlety, will walk straight into a trap. And a leader who is only a fox, all cleverness, no backbone, will get devoured the moment someone calls the bluff. The nice guy? He's neither. He's the lamb. And Machiavelli has no chapter for the lamb, because the lamb doesn't last long enough to warrant one. Now, this isn't about being fake. That's a common misread. Machiavelli isn't telling you to wear a mask for the sake of deception. He's saying something deeper. He's saying that the world does not hold still. Circumstances shift. People change. Alliances form and break. And if you are locked into one way of being, if your identity is, I'm the nice one, you've already lost. Because the moment the situation demands something other than nice, you have nothing to offer.
He warns about this directly. Machiavelli points out that men who are good in all things will inevitably come to ruin among so many who are not good. That's not pessimism, that's observation. He's looking at history, at the rise and fall of rulers, and he's telling you what he sees. The ones who survived weren't the most virtuous, they were the most adaptable. And there's a subtlety here that a lot of people miss. Machiavelli doesn't say abandon virtue. He says don't be enslaved by it.
There's a difference, a massive one. The prince can be generous, but he knows when generosity will be exploited. He can be merciful, but he knows when mercy will be mistaken for weakness. He holds every quality in his arsenal, and he deploys the right one at the right time. The nice guy doesn't do this. He can't, because he's made being nice his entire identity. So when the moment demands firmness, he folds. When the moment demands confrontation, he avoids. When the moment demands a hard truth, he softens it until it means nothing. Soft when soft works, hard when necessary, warm with allies, cold with enemies. Not because he's two-faced, but because he understands something the nice guy refuses to accept. The world doesn't reward consistency. It rewards competence. It rewards the person who can shift, adjust, and recalibrate without losing their footing. Machiavelli calls this adaptability the single most important quality a leader can have. Not morality, not charm, not even intelligence. Adaptability. Be water when the situation needs flow. Be fire when it needs force. Be whatever the moment demands. That's not manipulation, that's survival. Machiavelli says when it comes to enemies, you have exactly two options: win them over completely, or remove them from the board entirely. That's it. There's no third door. There's no kind of handling it. There's no half measure. And this is where nice guys get absolutely destroyed. Because what does the nice guy do? He does the worst possible thing. He injures someone just enough to make them angry, but not enough to stop them from hitting back. He'll push back a little, show some teeth for once, maybe even land a blow, and then he backs off. He feels guilty. He extends an olive branch. He tries to smooth things over. Machiavelli warns, that's not mercy. That's a death sentence you wrote for yourself. Because now you've got someone who's hurt, humiliated, and fully capable of retaliation. You gave them a reason to come after you,
and you left them with the power to do it. That's the worst position you can put yourself in. He's blunt about this. Men must either be caressed or annihilated. Those are his actual words, not paraphrased, not softened, caressed or annihilated. Because he argues, a man who is slightly injured will seek revenge, but a man who is crushed, he can't. Now, let's be clear about what this means. Machiavelli isn't telling you to go around destroying people for fun. He's not endorsing cruelty as entertainment. He's making a strategic point. If you've decided someone is your enemy, you don't get to be casual about it. You don't get to be polite about it. You either neutralize the threat completely or you make them an ally. But the middle ground? That middle ground is where people get buried. And the Machiavellian prince understands this instinctively. He doesn't leave wounded enemies walking around with grudges and long memories. He knows an enemy who's been embarrassed but not defeated is the most dangerous kind. They're watching, they're waiting, and the moment you slip, they move. The nice guy, on the other hand, lives in that middle ground. He confronts someone halfway, speaks up but not loud enough, sets a boundary but doesn't enforce it, and then wonders why people keep crossing it, why the same people keep coming back to take more from him. Machiavelli would look at that and say, "Of course they do. You taught them they could." See, he points out something uncomfortable. When you wound someone lightly, you don't earn their respect. You earn their contempt. They don't think, "Oh, he showed restraint." They think, "He's weak. He couldn't finish what he started." And now they're not just your enemy. They're your enemy with something to prove. So what does the prince do? He makes a decision, a clean one. If someone can be brought to his side, genuinely brought over, he does it with generosity, with respect. He makes the relationship so valuable that betrayal doesn't make sense. But if they can't be won, if the threat is real and it's not going away, he acts decisively. No hesitation, no half steps, no looking over his shoulder for the next 6 months. That's the difference. The nice guy creates enemies he can't control. The prince either has allies or has no enemies left to worry about. Machiavelli doesn't apologize for this, and he doesn't dress it up. It's not comfortable, but he argues it's the only way that actually works. Now, if you want to understand what Machiavelli actually meant by a Machiavellian prince, not the cartoon villain version, but the real thing, you need to look at the man he held up as the example, Cesare Borgia. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because Cesare Borgia was not a nice man, not by any definition. He was ruthless, he was violent, he deceived allies, crushed enemies, and eliminated anyone who stood in his way. By modern standards, and honestly, by the standards of his own time, he was terrifying. But Machiavelli didn't admire him because of the cruelty. That's what people get wrong. He admired him because of the competence, the strategy, the ability to look at a chaotic, hostile political landscape and impose order on it, by whatever means necessary. Machiavelli points out that Cesare inherited almost nothing on his own merit. His father was Pope Alexander VI, and it was through the church's power and French military support that Cesare first gained his territories. He didn't start from a position of earned strength. He started from borrowed power. And Machiavelli argues that this is the most dangerous position any leader can be in, relying on someone else's resources, someone else's goodwill. So what did Cesare do? He didn't sit back and enjoy the ride. He went to work, systematically. He consolidated his hold over the Romagna region. He won over the people, not through kindness, but through effective governance. The region had been lawless, chaotic, run by petty lords who bled the population dry. Cesare replaced that chaos with order. and Machiavelli notes this with genuine respect.
But here's the part that really shows you how Machiavelli thinks. Cesare appointed a man named Ramiro de Orco to pacify the Romagna. Ramiro was brutal, efficient but brutal. He got the job done, crushed dissent, established control, and once the dirty work was finished, Cesare had Ramiro publicly executed, cut in half and displayed in the town square.
Why? Because Machiavelli explains that Cesare understood something most leaders never grasp. The cruelty was necessary to establish order, but the resentment that cruelty created, that was a liability. So Cesare sacrificed the instrument of that cruelty. He gave the people someone to blame, someone to hate, and in doing so, he absorbed none of the backlash himself. He came out looking like the just ruler who punished excess. Cold, absolutely, but Machiavelli argues it was genius because it solved two problems at once. It pacified the region and it protected Cesare's reputation. And this is what Machiavelli means when he holds Cesare up as a model. Not that every leader should go around executing lieutenants in public squares, but that a leader must understand the full spectrum of what power demands. Kindness when it serves you, severity when it's required, and the intelligence to know which one the moment calls for. Machiavelli also acknowledges something crucial. Cesare ultimately failed. He lost everything. But he argues that this wasn't because of any flaw in Cesare's strategy. It was sheer bad luck. His father, the Pope, died unexpectedly, and Cesare himself fell gravely ill at the worst possible moment, right when he needed to act to secure his position. He couldn't control fate, and fate destroyed him. But Machiavelli's point still stands. He argues that Cesare did everything a capable prince could do. He planned, he adapted, he acted decisively. And if fortune hadn't turned against him so violently, he would have succeeded. That's the Machiavellian prince, not someone who's evil for the sake of it, someone who refuses to let idealism blind him to reality. Machiavelli argues, plainly, without apology, that a prince who always keeps his word will be destroyed by those who don't. Chapter 18 of The Prince. This is where he says the quiet part out loud. He writes that a wise ruler cannot and should not keep his promises when doing so would work against him, and when the reasons that made him promise no longer exist. And he doesn't frame this as a regrettable necessity. He frames it as a fundamental truth about how power operates. Now, before the moral objections start piling up, Machiavelli isn't celebrating dishonesty. He's diagnosing a reality. And the reality is this: the world does not reward rigid honesty. It punishes it. He points to history. Rulers who kept every promise, honored every agreement, held firm to every commitment, regardless of changing circumstances, those rulers lost. They lost territory, they lost alliances, they lost their thrones, and in some cases, they lost their lives. Not because they were bad leaders, but because they were predictable ones. And predictability, in a world full of people who don't play by the same rules, is a vulnerability. The nice guy makes promises and treats them as sacred. He gives his word and chains himself to it, even when the situation has changed, even when the other party has already broken their end, even when honoring that promise means walking straight into ruin. He does this because he believes integrity means consistency, that a good person never goes back on their word. Machiavelli would call that noble, and then he'd call it foolish. He argues that a prince must have the nature of both the fox and the lion. The lion fights, the fox recognizes traps, and a leader who is all lion, all brute force and blind honor, will walk into every trap set for him. You need the fox. You need the ability to read the room, assess what's changed and adjust, even if that adjustment means breaking a promise you made in good faith. And here's the part that really stings. Machiavelli observes that the people who break promises strategically are rarely punished for it. Why? Because they know how to frame it. They know how to present the broken promise as a necessary decision, a response to circumstances beyond their control, a sacrifice made for the greater good. And people accept it. People move on. Because people care less about consistency than they care about results.
The nice guy doesn't understand this. He thinks keeping his word is the highest currency. But Machiavelli warns, your word is only as valuable as the outcome it produces. A promise that leads to your destruction doesn't make you honorable, it makes you a cautionary tale. The Machiavellian prince doesn't give his word carelessly, and when he does give it, he understands that circumstances may demand he revise it. He's not a liar by nature, but he refuses to be a martyr by principle.
There's a hard distinction here. Machiavelli isn't saying lie constantly. He's saying don't let your promises become a leash someone else holds. The difference matters. One is reckless, the other is strategic. And the truth Machiavelli keeps circling back to is this: people judge you by outcomes, not by how faithfully you stuck to a plan that stopped working. The world remembers winners. It forgets the principled men who kept every promise and lost everything because of it. Keeping your word is a virtue, but Machiavelli argues it should never become a suicide pact.
There's a move the nice guy loves to make. He thinks it's smart, he thinks it's safe, and Machiavelli says it's the fastest way to guarantee your own destruction. It's neutrality, staying out of it, not picking a side, trying to keep everyone happy by refusing to commit to anyone.
The nice guy looks at a conflict and thinks, if I stay neutral, neither side can blame me. I'll be fine. Machiavelli heard that logic, and he demolished it. In chapter 21 of The Prince, he argues, forcefully, that neutrality is never a strategy, it's an abdication. A leader who refuses to take sides doesn't preserve his position, he abandons it.
Because here's what actually happens. The side that wins, they don't thank you for staying out of it. They resent you. You weren't there when it mattered. You didn't help when help was needed. You're not an ally. You're deadweight. And the side that loses, they hate you too. Because you could have tipped the balance. You could have made a difference. But you sat on your hands and watched them go down. So now you've got no friends, no allies, no one who owes you anything, and two parties who both have reasons to come after you. That's neutrality. That's the reward for trying to play it safe.
Machiavelli makes a sharp distinction here between the nice guy and the Machiavellian prince. The nice guy avoids conflict. He sees it as something to be managed, minimized, sidestepped. He doesn't want to make enemies, he doesn't want to burn bridges, so he stands in the middle and hopes the storm passes around him. The Machiavellian prince? He picks a side, decisively. Not recklessly, decisively. He assesses the situation, weighs his options, and commits. Because Machiavelli understood something the nice guy never does. Indecision is a decision, and it's the worst one you can make. He warns that a prince who tries to remain neutral will inevitably become the prey of the victor. You don't get to opt out of the game. You're in it whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you play it with purpose or get played by someone who does. And there's a deeper point here, one that goes beyond battlefield alliances and political maneuvering. Machiavelli argues that people respect commitment. Even if they disagree with your choice, they respect the fact that you made one. Neutrality doesn't signal wisdom. It signals weakness. It tells everyone around you that you lack the courage to stake a position, that you're more afraid of being wrong than you are committed to being effective. The nice guy reads that and pushes back. He says,
but what if I pick the wrong side? And Machiavelli's answer is blunt. You might. But even a wrong choice leaves you in a stronger position than no choice at all. Because at least you have an ally. At least someone sees you as a partner. At least you've demonstrated that you're capable of action. The man who stands for nothing, no one fights for him. No one risks anything for him. And when trouble comes, and it always comes, he stands alone. That's the deadly mistake. Not choosing the wrong side, choosing no side, believing that you can float above the fray and come out untouched. Machiavelli saw through that illusion 500 years ago. He called it what it was. Not prudence, not diplomacy, not wisdom. Cowardice with a more comfortable name. And the nice guy? He keeps making that mistake, over and over, wondering why no one ever has his back. Now he knows why. Machiavelli doesn't deal in abstractions. When he teaches, he uses images that burn into your mind. And perhaps none is more powerful than this one, the lion and the fox. He lays it out plainly. A prince who relies solely on force, the lion, will eventually walk into a trap he never saw coming. And a prince who relies solely on cunning, the fox, will eventually face a threat he can't outsmart. He'll be overpowered, torn apart. So Machiavelli argues that a true leader must embody both, not one or the other, both, simultaneously. And this is where most people get it wrong. The nice guy, he wants to be neither. He doesn't want to be the lion because force feels aggressive. He doesn't want to be the fox because cunning feels dishonest. So what does he become? Nothing. He becomes the man who stands in the middle of the arena with no claws and no strategy, hoping that his good intentions will somehow protect him. Machiavelli would call that foolishness, not because good intentions are bad, but because good intentions alone have never held a single throne, won a single war, or built a single lasting institution. Now let's break this down. The lion represents raw authority, dominance, the willingness to use force, not recklessly, but decisively when the moment demands it. Machiavelli argues that there are times when a leader must act with overwhelming strength. No hesitation, no apology. When enemies are circling, when rivals are testing your boundaries, the lion doesn't negotiate. The lion makes the cost of opposition so high that no one dares try again. But here's what Machiavelli warns. Pure force is blunt, it's visible, and it's predictable. A leader who only knows how to be the lion becomes easy to read. His enemies learn his patterns. They set traps. They bait him into overreacting. And then they destroy him, not with strength, but with patience and strategy. That's where the fox comes in. The fox is perception. It's reading the room before you enter it. It's knowing which ally is about to betray you before they even know it themselves. Machiavelli argues that the fox sees the traps, the hidden dangers, the political snares, the false friendships, and navigates around them. The fox doesn't fight what he can avoid. He doesn't confront what he can outmaneuver. And Machiavelli makes something very clear. Between the two, the fox is more essential. He writes that the one who has best known how to play the fox has fared best in the long run, because the world is full of traps, far more traps than wolves. And the leader who can't see them coming won't last, no matter how strong he is. But the genius of Machiavelli's argument isn't in choosing one over the other. It's in the fusion. The leader who can project the strength of the lion while operating with the intelligence of the fox, that leader is nearly impossible to defeat. He can intimidate when he needs to. He can deceive when he needs to. He knows when to roar and when to move in silence. The nice guy can't do this. He's locked into one mode: openness, transparency, approachability. And those are fine qualities in a friend.
But Machiavelli would argue they are fatal qualities in a leader who faces real opposition. A leader doesn't get to choose the nature of the threats that come for him, but he does get to choose how many tools he carries. The lion and the fox together, that's a full arsenal. Anything less, Machiavelli warns, is just waiting to be outplayed. This is the line that made Machiavelli infamous. The ends justify the means. 5 words that have been quoted, misquoted, twisted, and weaponized for over 500 years. But here's what most people miss. Machiavelli never actually wrote those exact words. Not like that. What he did argue, and this is important, is that in the actions of men, and especially of princes, the result is what matters. People don't judge you by your process, they judge you by your outcome. That's not a philosophy he invented, it's a pattern he observed. And the nice guy, he can't stomach this. The nice guy is obsessed with process, with doing things the right way. He believes that if his intentions are pure, if his methods are clean, the outcome will take care of itself. He'd rather lose honorably than win with dirt under his fingernails. And that sounds noble, it really does. But Machiavelli would ask him one simple question. What good is your honor if your kingdom falls? That's the tension at the heart of this. Machiavelli doesn't argue that morality is meaningless. He argues that morality is a luxury, one that a leader can only afford when conditions allow it. When survival is on the line, when the state is under threat, when enemies are circling, clinging to rigid ethics isn't virtue, it's negligence. He points out something uncomfortable. The people who are remembered as great leaders, the ones history celebrates, were not always clean. They made ugly decisions. They broke promises when those promises would have destroyed them. They used deception when transparency would have been suicide. And the world forgave them. Why? Because they delivered results. Stability, security, prosperity. The outcome erased the method. The nice guy doesn't operate this way. He holds on to his principles like a shield. But Machiavelli would say it's not a shield, it's a chain. It limits his options. It narrows his responses. And in a world that doesn't play by clean rules, limited options get you eliminated. Now, does this mean Machiavelli endorses cruelty for its own sake? No. He's very specific about this. He argues that harsh measures should be used swiftly, decisively, and only when necessary. Not prolonged, not excessive, not theatrical. A prince who drags out cruelty, who makes it a habit rather than a tool, that prince has lost control of himself, and Machiavelli has no respect for that. The Machiavellian prince doesn't enjoy the dirty work. He simply doesn't flinch from it when the situation demands it. He understands something the nice guy refuses to accept, that the world will not pause its chaos to accommodate your conscience. You act, you secure the outcome, and then you deal with the moral weight of it afterward. That's the burden of leadership. It's not pretty. It was never supposed to be. And here's the part that really stings. Machiavelli argues that the people, the very people the nice guy is trying to protect with his clean hands, those people don't care how it got done. They care that it got done. They want order. They want safety. They want a leader who delivers. The method? They'll forget it. The result? They'll remember it forever. So the nice guy stands in the ruins of his good intentions, wondering where it all went wrong. And the Machiavellian prince stands over a kingdom that's still intact, imperfect, scarred, maybe a little uglier than it should be, but intact. Machiavelli doesn't celebrate this. He simply refuses to look away from it. And that refusal, that unflinching honesty about how power actually works, is what separates strategy from sentimentality. Machiavelli makes one of his coldest and most honest when he talks about unarmed prophets. And this is where the nice guy's worldview completely falls apart. The nice guy believes that if his cause is just, if his intentions are pure, if his ideas are good, that should be enough. People will see the virtue. People will follow. The right thing will win because it's the right thing. Machiavelli calls this delusion, and he doesn't mince words about it. He draws a direct comparison. Armed prophets succeed. Unarmed prophets fail. That's it. He points to Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, men who had visions, yes, but more importantly, men who had the means to impose those visions. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for consensus. They built the power to make their ideas real, and then they used it. And then there's the other side. Machiavelli brings up Savonarola, the monk who rose to power in Florence on the strength of his moral conviction alone. No army, no enforceable authority, just words, just righteousness. And for a while it worked. People listened. People followed. But the moment the tide turned, the moment opposition hardened, Savonarola had nothing. No leverage, no force, no fallback. He was destroyed. Not because his ideas were wrong, but because he had no power to protect them. That's the lesson Machiavelli hammers home. Good ideas without enforcing power are just noise. They're wishes, they're dreams spoken aloud in a room full of people who don't care. And this is exactly the trap the nice guy falls into. He has good intentions. He might even have the right answer, but he refuses to accumulate power. He refuses to build leverage. He thinks that doing so would compromise his integrity, that seeking power is somehow beneath him, dirty, corrupt. Machiavelli would say, and history would agree, that's how you guarantee your own irrelevance. Here's what makes this so uncomfortable. It's not that the nice guy loses because he's wrong. He often loses because he's right, but powerless. And Machiavelli argues that being right without the ability to act on it is worse than being wrong with power. Because the person who's wrong but powerful can still shape outcomes. They can still move the world, even if in the wrong direction. The person who's right but powerless, they just watch and complain, and eventually get forgotten.
The Machiavellian prince understands this at a bone-deep level. He doesn't just cultivate ideas, he cultivates the means to enforce them. He builds alliances, he secures resources, he positions himself so that when he speaks, there's weight behind the words. Not just moral weight, real weight, the kind that makes people listen, not because they want to, but because they have to.
And there's a hard truth buried in here that the nice guy will never accept. Machiavelli points out that people are fickle. They'll rally behind you when times are good. They'll cheer your name when it costs them nothing. But the moment it gets difficult, the moment supporting you carries a price, they vanish. And if you have no power to hold them, no structure to bind their loyalty, you're standing alone. That's what an unarmed prophet is. Someone standing alone with a beautiful idea and no way to keep it alive. Machiavelli doesn't celebrate this. He doesn't say it's fair. He says it's real. And the prince, the one who actually wants to change something, build something, protect something, has to deal with what's real, not what should be. This is probably the most controversial thing Machiavelli ever wrote, and he knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote it. In chapter 25 of The Prince, he makes a claim that's been debated, condemned, and dissected for over 500 years. He says, "Fortune is a woman, and if you want to master her, you must be bold, forceful, even aggressive, because she yields," he argues, not to those who approach her cautiously, but to those who act with audacity. Now, before anyone shuts the book or this video, let's talk about what he's actually saying. because if you stop at the surface, you miss the deeper strategic point entirely. Machiavelli is not writing a guide on gender relations. He's using the metaphor his era understood to make a brutal point about how luck, chance, and circumstance actually work. And the point is this: passivity gets you nothing. He argues that fortune controls roughly half of human affairs, maybe even more. But the other half? That's on you. That's where your decisions, your preparation, and your willingness to act come in. And his frustration, the thing that drives this entire chapter, is watching people surrender that half, watching them sit back, play it safe, wait for the right moment, and get steamrolled. The nice guy's relationship with fortune, it's entirely passive. He waits, he hopes. He plays by the rules and expects the universe to reward him for it. When things go wrong, he says it wasn't meant to be. When opportunity shows up, he hesitates, because what if it's not the right time? What if he's not ready? What if someone judges him for reaching too far? Machiavelli looks at that and calls it exactly what it is: cowardice dressed up as patience. The prince, on the other hand, doesn't wait for fortune to smile on him. He moves. He acts before conditions are perfect, because he understands conditions are never perfect. Machiavelli argues that the man who adapts his approach to the times will succeed, but the man who clashes with the times, who's cautious when the moment demands aggression, or reckless when the moment demands restraint, he fails every time. And here's the part that really stings. Machiavelli points out that it is better to be impetuous than cautious. Because fortune, he says, favors the young, the bold, the ones who don't overthink, the ones who grab what's in front of them without asking permission first. He compares fortune to a violent river. When it floods, it destroys everything: trees, buildings, lives. Everyone runs. But, and this is key, he says the smart ones built dams and embankments long before the flood came. They prepared when the skies were clear, so when the river raged, it was contained, directed, managed. That's the Machiavellian approach to fortune. You don't control it, you can't, but you prepare for it. And when it shows up, whether as opportunity or as disaster, you meet it head on. You don't flinch. You don't retreat into caution. You act. The nice guy builds nothing. He stands in the open field and prays the river doesn't come his way. And when it does, he drowns. Not because he's unlucky, but because he refused to prepare. He refused to be bold. He refused to accept that the world doesn't reward good intentions. It rewards decisive action. Machiavelli's metaphor is crude, deliberately so. He wanted it to shock. He wanted it to be remembered. And 5 centuries later, it still is, because the truth underneath it hasn't changed one bit. You can lose money. You can lose allies, you can lose battles, but the moment you lose your reputation, you lose everything. Because reputation isn't just what people think of you, it's what they're willing to do for you, or against you. Machiavelli argues that a prince's reputation is his most valuable political asset, not his army, not his treasury, his reputation, and he's very specific about why. Because reputation controls perception, and perception, not reality, is what governs how people behave toward you. A prince who is perceived as strong doesn't need to fight as often. A prince who is perceived as generous doesn't need to give as much. A prince who is perceived as dangerous doesn't need to make threats. The perception does the work. That's the power of reputation. It fights your battles before they even begin. And this is where the nice guy gets it completely wrong. The nice guy believes that if he's good, people will naturally see him as good, that his character will speak for itself. That reputation is just a byproduct of behavior. Machiavelli would call that dangerously naive. He warns that reputation is not something that just happens to you. It's something you build, deliberately, strategically, and most importantly, something you guard with everything you have.
See, the Machiavellian prince doesn't leave his image to chance. He understands that people don't have access to your intentions. They only have access to your actions. And even then, they interpret those actions through their own biases, their own fears, their own interests. So the prince takes control of that narrative. He shapes how people see him, not through lies necessarily, but through deliberate presentation.
Machiavelli points out that the masses judge by appearances. They see what you seem to be. Very few get close enough to know what you actually are. And even those few, they won't speak up against the opinion of the many. So what the many believe about you, that becomes your reality, whether it's true or not. Now, the nice guy hears this and recoils. He thinks it's manipulative, dishonest. But Machiavelli isn't telling you to be fake. He's telling you to be intentional. There's a difference, a big one. The nice guy walks into a room and hopes people will figure out his worth. The Machiavellian prince walks into that same room and makes sure they do. And here's the part that really stings. Machiavelli warns that a damaged reputation is almost impossible to repair. You can spend years building credibility, and one moment of weakness, one public failure, one act of perceived cowardice, and it all collapses. The nice guy thinks forgiveness is easy, that people will understand, that second chances are freely given. Machiavelli says no. People remember what hurt them. They remember what embarrassed them. They remember what made them doubt you. And they carry that memory far longer than they carry any gratitude. So the Machiavellian prince protects his reputation, like a general protects his supply lines. Because without it, nothing else works. Your skills don't matter if no one respects you enough to give you the opportunity. Your loyalty doesn't matter if no one trusts you enough to rely on you. Your kindness doesn't matter if no one takes you seriously enough to value it. Reputation is not vanity, it's infrastructure. And Machiavelli makes that case with a clarity that still cuts through 5 centuries later.
There's a type of leader, and you've seen him, who prides himself on being merciful, being kind, being the good one. He forgives every offense. He avoids every hard decision. He wants, more than anything, to be liked. And Machiavelli looks at that man and says, "You're not kind. You're weak. And your weakness will destroy the very people you claim to protect."
This is one of the sharpest distinctions Machiavelli draws in The Prince. The difference between mercy as a genuine virtue and mercy as a disguise for cowardice. Because most people confuse the two. They think being soft is the same as being good. Machiavelli disagrees, strongly. He points to Cesare Borgia, a man history remembers as ruthless, cruel even. But Machiavelli argues that Borgia's so-called cruelty brought order to Romagna, a region that had been drowning in chaos, lawlessness, and factional violence. Borgia stepped in, used a heavy hand, and the result? Stability, peace. People could actually live their lives. Now contrast that with the leaders of Florence. Machiavelli highlights how they refused to act decisively when Pistoia was tearing itself apart through internal conflict. Why? Because they didn't want to be seen as cruel. They wanted to preserve their image. Their reputation as compassionate, measured rulers. And what happened? Pistoia was destroyed. The city burned, not because of cruelty, but because of the absence of it at the right moment. So Machiavelli asks a devastating question. Who was truly cruel? The man who used force to restore order? Or the men who stood by, hands clean, watching a city collapse, all so they could sleep at night calling themselves merciful.
That's the trap of the nice guy. He confuses inaction with virtue. He tells himself he's being compassionate when in reality, he's just avoiding discomfort. He doesn't want to make the hard call. He doesn't want to be the one people resent. So he does nothing. And the suffering continues, sometimes gets worse, because no one had the spine to stop it.
Machiavelli warns that a prince who is excessively merciful allows disorder to spread. Murders, robberies, chaos. And that chaos harms the entire community. But a prince who makes a few decisive, even harsh examples, he actually prevents far greater suffering down the line. The pain is concentrated, controlled, purposeful, not scattered and endless.
And here's what makes this so uncomfortable. Machiavelli isn't celebrating cruelty. He's not saying leaders should enjoy being harsh. He's saying they need to be willing to do what's necessary, even when it's ugly, because the alternative is worse, far worse. The nice guy doesn't understand this. He operates from a place of fear of judgment, fear of confrontation, fear of being the villain. But Machiavelli argues that a leader paralyzed by the need to be loved is a leader who will fail his people every single time. Mercy in Machiavelli's framework is only meaningful when it comes from a position of strength. When a ruler has the power to punish but chooses not to, that's mercy. When a ruler lacks the courage to punish and calls it compassion, that's self-deception. There's a hard line here, and most people don't want to see it, but Machiavelli draws it anyway. Kindness without the capacity for firmness isn't kindness. It's abdication. It's a leader abandoning his responsibility and dressing it up in noble language. The Machiavellian prince doesn't avoid mercy. He uses it deliberately, strategically, from a place of control, not fear. The nice guy, he hands out mercy like a reflex, not because it's right, but because it's easy. And Machiavelli makes clear, easy and right are rarely the same thing.
Machiavelli doesn't say morality doesn't matter. He says morality without power is irrelevant. It's decoration. It's a nice speech at a funeral. Yours. Machiavelli makes a brutal distinction that most people skip right over. He argues that the desire to be good and the ability to do good are two completely different things. And the gap between them? That gap is called power.
Without it, your good intentions are just intentions. They don't protect anyone. They don't build anything. They don't last. The nice guy believes that being moral is a strategy in itself. That if he's kind enough, fair enough, honest enough, the world will somehow reward him for it. Machiavelli looks at that belief and calls it what it is: dangerous naivete. He points out that history is filled with good men who were destroyed, not because they lacked virtue, but because they lacked the power to defend it. And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of his work. You cannot practice morality from a position of weakness. You can preach it, you can believe in it, but you cannot practice it, not in any way that actually matters. Machiavelli argues that the prince, the leader, the one who actually shapes outcomes, must first secure his position. First.
Before the charity, before the fairness, before the mercy. Because without a secure position, none of those things survive. They get swallowed up by someone who doesn't share your morals and doesn't care that you had them. Think about it this way. The nice guy walks into a room full of wolves and says, "I will lead by example." Machiavelli warns, the wolves don't care about your example. They care about your throat. He's not telling you to abandon morality. He's telling you to stop treating it like armor. It's not armor. It's a luxury. And luxuries are for those who've already handled the basics: survival, stability, strength. This is where people get Machiavelli wrong. They read him and think he's endorsing cruelty. He's not. He's endorsing sequence. He's saying, get power first. Establish your foundation, and then from that position of strength, you can afford to be generous. You can afford to be kind. You can afford to be moral, because now your morality has teeth. Now it's backed by something real. But the man who tries to be moral before he's powerful, Machiavelli warns, that man doesn't become a saint. He becomes a cautionary tale. And here's what makes this so hard to accept. Most people have been taught the opposite. They've been told that goodness comes first and power follows. That if you just do the right thing, influence and respect will come to you naturally. Machiavelli rejects that entirely. He argues that this is a fantasy, a comforting story that benefits the people already in power, because it keeps everyone else passive, obedient, waiting. The Machiavellian prince doesn't wait. He understands that morality is not the starting point, it's the destination. But the road to get there? That road requires calculation. It requires toughness. Sometimes it requires doing things that won't look good in a biography. So the question Machiavelli forces you to confront isn't, are you a good person? That's easy. Everyone thinks they're good. The real question is, do you have the power to make your goodness matter? And if the answer is no, then according to Machiavelli, your goodness is just a story you tell yourself while the world moves on without you. Machiavelli has a line that should be carved into the desk of every leader, every strategist, every person who's ever had something to protect. He compares political problems to a disease, and he warns, in the early stages, a disease is easy to cure but hard to detect. In the later stages, it's easy to detect but nearly impossible to cure. That's not just political advice. That's a law of power. The nice guy sees a small problem forming, a rival gaining influence, a crack in an alliance, a subtle shift in loyalty, and he hesitates. He tells himself it's not that serious. He tells himself it'll work itself out. He doesn't want to overreact, doesn't want to seem paranoid, doesn't want to create conflict where there isn't one yet. Machiavelli says that hesitation is the beginning of the end. He argues that the prince who waits for a problem to become obvious has already lost the advantage, because by the time a threat is visible to everyone, it's entrenched, it has allies, it has momentum, and now removing it will cost 10 times more than it would have cost when it was still small and manageable. This is one of the sharpest differences between the nice guy and the Machiavellian prince. The nice guy is reactive. He responds to crises after they arrive. The Machiavellian prince is preemptive. He eliminates threats before they mature, before they have teeth, before they become problems that require war instead of a conversation. And Machiavelli points out something that most people overlook. The preemptive strike is almost always criticized. People will call it unnecessary, aggressive, disproportionate, because they can't see the threat that was prevented. They only see the action that was taken, and that action in the moment looks like overreach. But Machiavelli argues, being criticized for acting too early is infinitely better than being destroyed for acting too late. The prince who strikes first might be called a tyrant. The prince who waits will be called a fool. And between those two labels, one of them is still in power. He draws from the Romans to make this point. The Romans, he observes, never let a problem grow just to avoid conflict. They understood that war deferred is not war avoided. It's war on worse terms. So they dealt with threats immediately, aggressively, decisively. And that discipline, that willingness to act before the moment felt urgent, is what built an empire. The nice guy doesn't think this way. The nice guy believes in patience, in diplomacy, in giving people the benefit of the doubt.
And those aren't bad instincts in a world where everyone plays fair. But Machiavelli warns, that world doesn't exist. It never has. And the leader who governs as though it does is building on sand. Here's what makes this so difficult. The preemptive strike requires you to act on incomplete information. You won't have certainty. You won't have proof. You'll have instinct, pattern recognition, a feeling that something is off. And you'll have to act on that, knowing full well that if you're right, no one will thank you. And if you're wrong, everyone will blame you.
Machiavelli acknowledges this, but he argues that the cost of inaction is almost always greater than the cost of premature action, because inaction doesn't preserve peace. It preserves the illusion of peace, and illusions shatter.
The Machiavellian prince doesn't wait for the fire to reach his door. He smells the smoke and moves. Not out of fear, out of calculation, out of the understanding that small problems don't stay small. They grow, they compound, and by the time they demand your attention, they may already be beyond your control.
You can have the biggest army in the world, the sharpest swords, the tallest walls, and none of it will hold a population together the way belief does. Machiavelli understood this deeply, and he wasn't shy about saying it.
In the Discourses on Livy, he makes a case that most people find uncomfortable. He argues that religion, not faith, not spirituality, religion as a system, is the single most powerful tool a ruler has for maintaining order. More powerful than law, more powerful than punishment, more powerful than any standing army. And he backs it up with history. He points to Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. Romulus built Rome through force, through blood. But Machiavelli argues that it was Numa who actually made Rome last. How? Not by conquering enemies, not by expanding borders, by introducing religion. By constructing rituals, ceremonies, sacred institutions, he gave the Roman people something to believe in, something bigger than themselves. And through that belief, he achieved what violence alone never could: obedience, voluntary obedience. That distinction matters, because a sword can make someone kneel, but it can't make someone want to kneel. Religion does that. Machiavelli saw this with absolute clarity. He argues that when people fear divine punishment, they regulate themselves. You don't need a soldier on every corner. You don't need a spy in every household. The people police their own behavior because they believe someone is always watching, someone who can't be bribed, can't be fooled, can't be escaped. That's control on a level no army can deliver. Now, here's where the nice guy falls apart on this subject. The nice guy looks at religion and sees only its moral dimension, its goodness, its sincerity, and that's fine for a private citizen. But Machiavelli is not writing for private citizens, he's writing for rulers. And for a ruler, the question is never, is this true? The question is this useful? He doesn't waste time debating theology. He doesn't care whether the gods are real. What he cares about is whether the people believe the gods are real, and whether that belief can be directed toward stability, loyalty, and order. That's the cold calculus the nice guy refuses to engage with. Machiavelli also warns about what happens when religion is corrupted or weakened. He points to the church of his own time, the Roman Catholic Church, and essentially accuses it of rotting Italy from the inside, not because it was too powerful, but because it was powerful enough to prevent unity, yet too corrupt to inspire genuine devotion. It kept Italy fragmented, weak, dependent. He saw a religious institution that had lost its ability to command real belief, and with it, its ability to serve as a political foundation. So the lesson he draws is sharp. Religion in the hands of a capable ruler is the ultimate force multiplier. It binds a people together.
It gives them shared identity, shared purpose, shared fear.
But religion in the hands of a corrupt or incompetent institution, it becomes a poison, a divider, a source of decay. The Machiavellian prince doesn't mock religion, he doesn't dismiss it, he respects its power, and he uses it. He appears devout, he speaks the language of faith, he wraps his authority in sacred cloth, not because he's a hypocrite, but because he understands something the nice guy doesn't. People don't follow leaders, they follow meaning, and whoever controls the meaning controls everything.
Machiavelli makes a cold, uncomfortable observation in his book, The Prince. He says, and this is almost a direct quote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are." Sit with that for a second, because that one line dismantles the entire worldview the nice guy builds his life around. The nice guy believes something deep in his bones. He believes that if he's good, genuinely, authentically good, people will eventually see it. They'll recognize it. They'll reward it.
He thinks his character speaks for itself, that who he is on the inside is what matters most. Machiavelli says no, that's not how the world works, and it never has been. He argues that people don't judge you by your soul. They judge you by your surface, by what they can see, by what you project.
Not because they're shallow, but because they're busy. They're distracted. They have their own problems, their own ambitions, their own fears. They don't have the time or the interest to dig beneath your exterior and discover the real you. And this is where the Machiavellian prince operates differently. He understands something the nice guy refuses to learn, that perception is the battlefield, not intention, not sincerity. Perception. Machiavelli points out that a prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright. Notice that word, appear. He doesn't say a prince must be all those things at all times. He says a prince must look like he is, because the moment people believe you are those things, that belief becomes your power. Now, does that make the Machiavellian prince a fraud? Not exactly. Machiavelli isn't advising people to be hollow. He's warning them not to be invisible. There's a difference. The nice guy who's generous behind closed doors but can't command a room, nobody knows he's generous. It doesn't register. It doesn't count. Not in the arena of influence. Not in the arena of power. And that's the brutal part. Machiavelli argues that unperceived virtue is politically useless. You can be the most honest, most decent person in the room, but if no one sees it, or worse, if they see weakness instead, then your virtue works against you. The Machiavellian prince doesn't leave his reputation to chance. He curates it. He controls the narrative. Not through lies necessarily, but through deliberate presentation. He knows that a single act of visible strength can do more for his standing than a lifetime of quiet integrity. Machiavelli warns that the gap between how people live and how they ought to live is so wide that anyone who ignores what is actually done in favor of what should be done, that person learns his own destruction rather than his preservation. That's not a suggestion, that's a warning, a serious one. So what does the nice guy do wrong here? He refuses to manage how he's seen. He thinks managing perception is dishonest, manipulative, beneath him. And while he's busy protecting his moral purity, someone else is shaping the story. Someone else is being seen as the leader, the capable one, the one who gets things done. Machiavelli doesn't celebrate this. He simply observes it. The world does not ask who you are. It watches what you show. And the people who understand that, the ones willing to be strategic about their image without abandoning their substance, those are the ones who hold power. The nice guy waits to be understood. The Machiavellian prince makes sure he's perceived correctly.
That's not deception, that's survival. Taking power and keeping power, they're not the same skill. They're not even close. And the people who are great at one are almost always terrible at the other. Machiavelli makes this point with ruthless clarity. He argues that the qualities that make someone a brilliant conqueror, aggression, boldness, the willingness to burn everything down and charge forward, those same qualities become liabilities the moment they sit on the throne. Because conquest is about disruption, ruling is about order, and the mindset that thrives in chaos rarely knows how to build stability.
Think about what it takes to seize power. You need momentum, you need audacity, you need to move faster than everyone around you, take risks no reasonable person would take, and bulldoze through opposition. That's the conqueror's game. But then what? You've won, you're in charge, and now every single skill that got you there is working against you. Machiavelli warns that this is where most new princes collapse, not because they lacked strength, not because their enemies were too powerful, but because they never learned the second game, the harder game, the game of holding what you've taken. And this is where the nice guy makes a fatal error. He assumes that once he's in a position of authority, once he's been given power, earned a promotion, built something, he can simply be kind, be fair, be generous, and people will stay loyal. Machiavelli would call that dangerously naive, because the moment you hold power, you become a target, and kindness without strategy is just an invitation for someone hungrier to take what's yours. But here's the other side. The pure Machiavellian conqueror, the one who clawed his way to the top through sheer force and cunning, he faces a different problem. Machiavelli points out that ruling requires consent. Not complete consent. Not everyone has to love you, but you need enough of the population to tolerate your rule, or you'll spend every waking moment putting out fires. And a conqueror who only knows how to fight, he'll treat every problem like a battle, every disagreement like a rebellion, every critic like an enemy. That's exhausting, and it's unsustainable. Machiavelli argues that the truly effective prince, the one who actually lasts, is the one who can make the shift, who can be the conqueror when the situation demands it, and then become the administrator, the builder, the strategist who consolidates. He has to know when the sword is useful and when it needs to go back in the sheath. This is something most people get wrong about Machiavelli's work. They think he's glorifying ruthlessness. He's not. He's warning you that ruthlessness alone is a dead end. It gets you to the top, and then it gets you killed. The nice guy fails because he won't fight to protect what he has. The conqueror fails because he can't stop fighting long enough to actually govern. Machiavelli saw both of these as traps, two different kinds of weakness dressed up as strength. So what does he recommend? Adaptability. Not in some vague feel-good sense, in a cold, calculated sense. He argues that a prince must read the situation, every situation, and respond with the exact tool that moment requires. Sometimes that's generosity, sometimes that's force, sometimes that's silence. But the man who only has one mode, he's already on borrowed time. And borrowed time, Machiavelli would remind you, always runs out. Machiavelli has a chapter in The Prince that people often skip over because they think it's purely about military strategy. It's about mercenaries, hired soldiers, and on the surface it seems irrelevant to modern life. But dig a little deeper, and it's one of the most important lessons he ever wrote. Machiavelli argues that mercenaries are useless, worse than useless, they're dangerous, and his reasoning is razor sharp. A mercenary fights for money, not for loyalty, not for belief, not for you. The moment the pay stops, the protection stops. The moment a better offer comes along, they switch sides.
And the moment real danger shows up, the kind that money can't compensate for, they disappear. He warns that any prince who builds his defense on mercenaries is building on sand, because you've handed your survival to people who have no stake in your survival. They don't care if you fall. They only care if they get paid. Now, strip away the military language and look at what Machiavelli is really saying. Never outsource the things that keep you alive. Never depend entirely on people who have no real loyalty to you. Never put your security, financial, emotional, professional, in the hands of someone whose commitment is transactional. And this is exactly what the nice guy does, constantly. The nice guy outsources his confidence to other people's approval. He outsources his sense of worth to relationships. He outsources his security to institutions, bosses, partners, anyone who seems willing to carry the weight for him. And he calls it trust. He calls it teamwork. He calls it being a good person. Machiavelli would call it a death sentence. Because here's what happens. The moment that boss decides you're expendable, you're gone. The moment that partner changes their mind, you're alone. The moment that institution restructures, you're irrelevant. And you're left standing there with nothing. Not because you were betrayed, but because you never built anything of your own. The Machiavellian prince doesn't make that mistake. He builds his own capabilities, his own resources, his own strength. He might use allies, he might form partnerships, but he never, ever lets someone else hold the keys to his survival. Machiavelli is very clear on this. The prince must have his own arms, his own foundation, something that belongs to him and cannot be taken away by someone else's decision. And there's a deeper layer here that's worth sitting with. Machiavelli points out that relying on mercenaries doesn't just leave you vulnerable, it makes you weak. Because when you never have to defend yourself, you never develop the ability to defend yourself. You atrophy, you become soft, and when the crisis finally comes, and it always comes, you don't have the muscle to survive it. The nice guy avoids conflict, avoids confrontation, avoids the hard, uncomfortable work of building his own defenses. And he tells himself it's because he's peaceful, because he's easygoing. But Machiavelli sees through that. He argues that what looks like peace is often just dependence dressed up in nice language. The Machiavellian prince doesn't avoid hardship. He prepares for it. He trains for it. He makes sure that when everything external falls away, the allies, the resources, the comfortable arrangements, he can still stand on his own. That's not paranoia. That's sovereignty. And Machiavelli makes the distinction unmistakable. The prince who relies on others lives at their mercy. The prince who relies on himself lives on his own terms. That's not just a political lesson, that's a life lesson. You can have the purest heart, the noblest intentions, the most righteous plan, but if the outcome is ruin, if people suffer, if the state crumbles, if the mission collapses, your good intentions mean nothing, absolutely nothing. Machiavelli understood this at a bone-deep level. He argues that a prince is judged not by the morality of his methods, but by the quality of his results. The world doesn't hand out prizes for trying hard. It rewards those who deliver, and it punishes those who don't, regardless of how well-meaning they were. This is where the nice guy gets crushed. He believes that being ethical in process guarantees a just outcome, that if he plays fair, does the right thing at every turn, the universe will somehow cooperate. Machiavelli would call that delusion, not because ethics don't matter, but because the world doesn't operate on fairness. It operates on power, consequence, and outcome. He writes plainly, everyone sees what you appear to be.
Few experience what you really are, and those few will not dare oppose the opinion of the many who have the majesty of the state defending them. What does that mean? It means perception is shaped by results. Win, and people will justify your methods after the fact. Lose, and no amount of moral reasoning will save your reputation. Machiavelli points to history over and over again to make this case. Leaders who succeeded through cunning, through deception, through brutal pragmatism, they're remembered as great, not because people approved of their methods in the moment, but because the outcomes spoke louder than the process. Stability, prosperity, survival. That's what people remember. That's what people respect.
And the leaders who were good, honest, principled to a fault, Machiavelli notes how many of them were overthrown, exiled, destroyed, not by villains, but by the sheer reality that goodness, without competence and ruthlessness when needed, is not enough to hold power. This isn't a comfortable idea, but Machiavelli doesn't deal in comfort. He deals in what works. He argues that a prince must learn how not to be good, not because virtue is worthless, but because rigid virtue in a world full of people who aren't virtuous is a death sentence. The nice guy clings to his principles like a shield, but Machiavelli warns that shield only works if everyone else is playing by the same rules, and they're not.
So, what does the Machiavellian prince do differently? He focuses on outcomes. He asks, what does this situation require? Not what does my moral code prefer, not what will make me feel righteous, but what will actually work, what will protect the state, what will preserve order, what will keep people alive.
And when the results come in, when the city is stable, the enemies are neutralized, the people are secure, nobody asks how it happened. They just know it did. That's the brutal math Machiavelli lays out. The nice guy wants credit for his heart. The Machiavellian prince earns respect through his results. And Machiavelli makes this distinction without apology. He doesn't argue that intentions are irrelevant on some philosophical level. He argues that they're irrelevant on a practical one.
Because in the arena of leadership, in the arena of real consequence, the scoreboard doesn't track your motives. It tracks what you built, what you held, what you left behind. Good intentions without results, that's a tragedy dressed up as virtue. Results without good intentions, that's power. And Machiavelli suggests the world has always known which one it respects more.
This is one of the most ruthless and most effective plays in Machiavelli's entire playbook. And it reveals something about power that most people would rather not look at directly. Machiavelli lays it out through a story, a real one. Cesare Borgia needed to bring order to the Romagna, a lawless, chaotic region that was tearing itself apart. So what did he do? He appointed a man named Ramiro di Orco, a cruel, efficient enforcer, a man willing to do whatever was necessary, and Borgia gave him full authority to do it. And Ramiro did exactly what was expected. He crushed the disorder. He used harsh measures. He restored stability. But in the process, he became hated, feared, despised by the people. Now here's where the strategy turns. Once the dirty work was done, Borgia didn't reward Ramiro. He didn't stand beside him and share the blame. He destroyed him, had him killed, cut in half and displayed in the public square as a message. Machiavelli describes this moment with chilling precision. Borgia essentially told the people, that cruelty you suffered, that wasn't me, that was him, and I've dealt with him for you. One move, and Borgia absorbed all the credit for the stability, while offloading all the hatred onto a dead man who could no longer defend himself. Machiavelli doesn't present this as something to be horrified by. He presents it as something to be studied, because the logic underneath it is airtight.
The prince needed order, but he also needed to be loved. He couldn't have both at the same time. So he separated the process into 2 phases. Phase 1, let someone else be the villain. Phase 2, become the hero who removes the villain. And the people, they accepted it, gladly, because people don't investigate power, they experience it. They felt the relief, they saw the justice, and that was enough. Machiavelli argues that this is not an exception, it's a pattern. Leaders throughout history have used agents, ministers, enforcers, people who carry out the unpleasant but necessary tasks, and then discarded them when public opinion shifted. The scapegoat absorbs the cost. The prince keeps his hands clean. Now, the nice guy would never do this. The nice guy would either refuse to appoint someone like Ramiro in the first place and let the chaos continue, or he'd appoint him, share in the backlash, and lose his position alongside him. Either way, the nice guy loses. Not because he's wrong morally, but because he doesn't understand the mechanics of how power actually operates. Machiavelli warns that sentimentality in leadership is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability. The prince who can't make hard, cold decisions about people, including people who've served him, is a prince who won't last. Loyalty matters, but survival matters more. And that's the part that stings, because most people want to believe that doing the right thing and keeping power go hand in hand. Machiavelli says they don't, not always. Sometimes the right move is ugly. Sometimes it requires sacrificing someone who was useful because their usefulness has expired and their presence has become a liability. The scapegoat strategy isn't about being evil. It's about understanding that perception is the currency of power, and sometimes you have to spend someone else's reputation to protect your own. Borgia understood that. Ramiro didn't. And that difference, that awareness of how the game is actually played, is exactly what separates the Machiavellian prince from everyone else standing in the wreckage wondering what happened. Most people think the biggest threat to a leader is the enemy at the gate, the rival, the competitor, the one who openly wants to take what you have. Machiavelli disagrees. He argues that the most dangerous people in any leader's life aren't the ones who oppose him. They're the ones who agree with him, constantly, unconditionally, without hesitation. Flatterers. Machiavelli dedicates serious attention to this problem, and he treats it as exactly that, a problem, not a minor annoyance, not a social nuisance, a genuine structural threat to anyone in a position of power. Because a flatterer doesn't attack your position, he attacks something far more valuable, your judgment. And once your judgment is gone, everything else follows. See, the nice guy, he doesn't guard against flattery. He welcomes it. He surrounds himself with people who tell him what he wants to hear, and he mistakes that for loyalty. He thinks agreement is the same as alignment. It's not. Agreement can be bought. Alignment has to be earned. And a room full of people nodding along with everything you say isn't a sign of good leadership. Machiavelli warns it's a sign of impending disaster. He points out that flatterers succeed because they exploit a very specific weakness in human nature, the desire to be validated. Every person, no matter how disciplined, wants to believe they're right, wants to believe their instincts are sharp, and the flatterer knows this. He feeds that hunger. He tells you your plan is brilliant. He tells you your rivals are fools. He tells you exactly what your ego needs to hear at exactly the right moment. And by the time you realize he was wrong, or worse, that he knew he was wrong, the damage is already done. Machiavelli argues that the Machiavellian prince handles this differently. He doesn't ban honesty, he demands it, but he demands it carefully. He selects a small number of trusted advisors and gives them explicit permission to speak the truth, only on matters he asks about, only in private, And he makes it clear that their value lies not in making him feel good, but in making him see clearly.
That's a critical distinction. The nice guy wants comfort. The prince wants clarity. And those two things almost never come from the same source. But here's where Machiavelli adds a layer that most people miss. He warns that even this system has risks. If a prince allows everyone to speak freely to him at all times, he loses respect. People stop fearing his authority. So the balance is precise. Controlled honesty from selected people on selected topics at selected times. Not a free-for-all, a structure.
The prince doesn't want yes men, but he also doesn't want a court full of people who feel entitled to challenge him publicly. He wants the truth delivered privately and respect maintained publicly. That's the balance Machiavelli lays out. And it's a balance the nice guy never even thinks about. Because the nice guy is too busy being liked, too busy being agreeable, too busy keeping everyone comfortable. And in that comfort, flatterers thrive. They burrow in. They become indispensable, not because they're useful, but because they're pleasant. And pleasantness, Machiavelli warns, is one of the most effective disguises for incompetence. An enemy you can see coming, an enemy you can prepare for, an enemy in many ways keeps you sharp. But a flatterer dulls every edge you have, slowly, quietly, with a smile. And Machiavelli makes no mistake about which one he considers more lethal. The nice guy has a fatal habit. He's consistent, transparent. He tells you exactly what he's going to do, and then he does it every single time. And the world applauds him for it, calls him honest, reliable, trustworthy. Machiavelli calls him a target. Because here's the thing about predictability. It feels safe. It feels virtuous. But in any arena where power is contested, politics, war, rivalry, being predictable is the same as handing your opponent a map of your every move. Machiavelli makes this point repeatedly across his work. He argues that a prince must never allow others to fully read him, not his allies, not his enemies, not even his own court. The moment people can anticipate you with certainty, they can plan around you. They can outmaneuver you. They can neutralize you before you even act, and you won't see it coming because you were too busy being authentic. He points to the great commanders of history, the ones who won not by being stronger, but by being unpredictable. Hannibal, Cesare Borgia, these were men who kept everyone guessing. Their allies stayed loyal, partly out of respect, partly out of uncertainty. Their enemies hesitated because they could never be sure what was coming next. That hesitation, that's power. That's what unpredictability buys you. Machiavelli argues that a ruler should cultivate a kind of strategic ambiguity, not chaos, not randomness for its own sake, but a deliberate refusal to become legible. Sometimes you're generous, sometimes you're ruthless, sometimes you forgive, sometimes you don't. And no one can quite figure out the pattern because there isn't one they can map. The nice guy can't do this. He won't do this because it violates his deepest instinct to be understood, to be seen as good. He wants people to know his heart. He wants them to trust his word absolutely. And so he lays himself bare. Machiavelli would say that's not integrity, that's exposure. There's a line in The Prince where he essentially warns that a ruler who is too well understood becomes too easy to manipulate. People learn his triggers. They learn what flattery works on him. They learn where his guilt lives, where his mercy kicks in, what arguments will soften him. And once they know all that, they own him, not through force, through knowledge. That's the real danger. Not that your enemies will attack you head on, but that they'll study you, map you, and then move around you like water around a stone, because they know exactly where the stone sits and it never moves. The Machiavellian prince doesn't give them that luxury. He shifts, he adapts, he keeps a part of himself, his true calculations, his real intentions, permanently in shadow. Not because he's dishonest by nature, but because he understands that full transparency in a competitive world is a form of surrender. And Machiavelli is clear about something else. This isn't about being erratic. It's not about being unreliable for the sake of it. A ruler who's genuinely chaotic destroys trust entirely and collapses his own base. The skill, the real skill, is in being stable enough to govern, but fluid enough to never be cornered. That's a razor's edge, and most people can't walk it. The nice guy won't even try. He'd rather be predictable and good than adaptable and safe. Machiavelli doesn't judge him for that. He just notes, very calmly, that predictable men rarely stay in power for long.
So, what does Machiavelli's ideal prince actually look like? Not the cartoon villain people assume when they hear the word Machiavellian. Not the backstabbing schemer, not the tyrant who rules through fear alone. It's more nuanced than that, and more demanding. Machiavelli argues that the ideal prince is above all adaptable. He's not locked into one mode of operating. He doesn't cling to kindness when the situation demands from this. He doesn't default to aggression when diplomacy would serve him better.
He reads the room and he adjusts every single time. That's the first thing. Flexibility, not as a lack of principle, but as a form of intelligence. Machiavelli points out that the prince who binds himself rigidly to one way of behaving will inevitably be destroyed by changing circumstances. The world shifts, alliances break, people change their loyalties, and the leader who can't shift with them, he gets left behind. Or worse, he gets crushed. But adaptability alone isn't enough. Machiavelli also insists that the ideal prince must possess what he calls virtù. And this is important because virtù in Machiavelli's framework is not virtue the way most people understand it. It's not about being good. It's about being effective. It's skill. It's decisiveness. It's the ability to act boldly when fortune shifts against you. He compares fortune to a river in flood. You can't stop it. But if you've built the dams and channels before the flood arrives, you can direct it. That's virtù, preparation meeting opportunity. And the ideal prince never waits for the crisis to start building. There's another quality Machiavelli emphasizes, and it's one the nice guy almost always lacks: the willingness to be feared, not hated. Machiavelli draws a sharp line between the two. He argues that it's far safer to be feared than loved, if you can't be both. But he warns, never be hated. Fear creates order. Hatred creates rebellion. The ideal prince walks that line with precision. And how does he avoid hatred? Machiavelli says, don't touch people's property. Don't touch their families. People will forgive a lot. They'll tolerate hard leadership, unpopular decisions, even ruthlessness, as long as you don't take what's theirs. The moment you become greedy or invasive in that way, you lose them, for good. Machiavelli also argues that the ideal prince must be a student of conflict, not because he loves war, but because war is the reality of power. He says a prince should never let his mind rest from the study of it. In peacetime, he trains. He studies terrain. He reads history. He learns how past leaders won, and more importantly, how they lost. And this is a critical point. Machiavelli holds that the ideal prince is deeply self-educated, not through abstract philosophy, through practical knowledge, through studying real outcomes, through understanding what actually happened, not what should have happened. One more thing. The ideal prince, according to Machiavelli, surrounds himself with competent advisors, but never surrenders his judgment to them. He listens, he questions. But the final decision is always his, because the moment a leader lets others think for him, he stops being a leader. He becomes a puppet. So when you put it all together, Machiavelli's ideal prince is not a monster. He's a strategist, disciplined, calculated, self-aware. He knows when to be gentle and when to be severe. He controls his image, manages his alliances, and never, ever mistakes comfort for safety. That's the blueprint. Not moral, not immoral. Effective.